Hello and welcome to 2025. Listen, before I go any further, I want to give you an apology. I record an episode of Miss Dr. Kenya once every month, and I did not record in January of 2025. Again, please accept my apologies. I did not record because I fully expected an executive order to be signed that would have a significant impact on the Department of Education, if not do away with it altogether. And if there was such an executive order, I wanted to take the time to review it with you to help you to understand how that executive order would impact children in schools. There has not been an executive order signed to date that has done away with the Department of Education. There have been 4 executive orders and 4 executive memorandums that do have an impact on children in school. And I do want to spend this month's recording reviewing them with you and talking about what are some things that you can do to make sure that you are supporting your student to the very best of your ability. But before I do that, I just want to share the obvious. I hope it's obvious as to why the Department of Education is so very important. Now, the Department of Education does many great things, from holding schools accountable for making sure that children, especially children from underserved and marginalized communities, that they can thrive. They do a lot of different things, but I want to call out 2 primary functions that they do today. The first one is that they provide funding. About 60% of college students right now are in school based upon funding, either a loan or a grant that they received from the Department of Education. 60%. And that number increases significantly, again, when you think about underserved and marginalized communities like women, African Americans, Indigenous people, so on and so forth. But not only does it provide funding for students to be able to access higher education, it also supports students from pre-K through 12th grade. One of the main ways that comes to mind for me is by way of providing free and reduced lunch for students. You guys have heard me talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs many times on Miss Dr. Kenya. And the very first thing that Maslow says that we need are our physiological needs, and that's food, clothing, and shelter. Again, according to Maslow, we don't get to that highest tier, which is self-actualization, until those lower levels are met. And the most basic lower level is indeed access to food. Another way that the Department of Education provides funding is they do so through Title I programming. So Title I allows schools that work with students who have large numbers of impoverished students. They provide additional funding to those Title I schools to increase the likelihood that students who are suffering from high levels of poverty, to make sure that those students are able to meet their academic goals. Okay? So one of the main things that the Department of Education does is it provides funding. However, the Department of Education also makes sure that students who have learning disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health disorders, and other impairments that impact their ability to access the general education curriculum, the Department of Education makes sure that these students have access to accommodations, modifications, related service providers like speech and language pathologists and counselors, and also ensures that those who need it have access to specialized instruction. So the Department of Education is pivotal for many reasons. And I just called out the 2 that kind of jump out for me that are truly important for my audience. But I do want to stop and pause, because while I did say that the Department of Education holds schools accountable, especially for those who have learning disabilities and mental health disorders and physical disabilities, you may feel like, well, that has nothing to do with me. I don't have any of those things. I do want to just make sure that you are aware that in schools, most educators provide accommodations and modifications informally. So what am I talking about? Let's say that you are a student who needs eyeglasses and you're struggling to see the board. More often than not, your educator would say, come and sit closer to the board so that you can see. That's an accommodation. A modification can be as simple as using a calculator on a test. These things are often offered to us informally, but there are some students who need accommodations, modifications, specialized instruction, and or access to related service providers. So they need a little bit more than an accommodation and an modification. And we want to make sure that we are providing these things, these resources to those students, and that we are progress monitoring to make sure that what we are doing is actually helpful. And so when that happens, we track what we give to students on a plan. More often than not, it's a 504 plan or an IEP. But there is no such thing as a normal profile. The truth of the matter is, all of us have things that we are good at. We all have things that we are bad at. And at some point in our academic career, we've needed help. The difference is that we've often received that help informally and not by way of a formal plan. The Department of Education really enforces the law to make sure that those students who need those things by way of a plan so that we can progress monitor, that those students get those supports that they need. But again, at some point, we've all been supported by our educator, by our school system. So now that we understand why the Department of Education is so important, let's talk about what an executive order is and an executive memorandum is. Again, we're going to discuss 4 executive orders and 4 executive memorandums that do have an impact on students in schools. But let's first talk about what they are. An executive order, it's big business. It carries the weight of a law. It can not be blocked by Congress, but it can be challenged in the court. Executive orders are all numbered and they are registered in the Federal Register. That's important. It is because of that number and the fact that they are in the Federal Register that we can always track an executive order. Well, that's not true for an executive memorandum. An executive memorandum is less formal. It is, for all intents and purposes, the president sharing those in the executive branch, right, the branch that he oversees. That is him telling them that, hey, this is something that I want done, and this is how I want you to do it. Executive memorandums often are not numbered, and they are not registered in the Federal Register. This means that they are harder to track, if at all. Another thing that I want to point out with an executive memorandum is that an executive memorandum cannot be challenged. The only way to undo an executive memorandum is if the person who wrote the executive order, and in this case, the president, rescinds it. So let me go over those 2 distinctions again. An executive order has the weight of law, can be challenged, can be tracked. An executive memorandum is less formal. It is ultimately the president giving details for an administrative task that he wants followed through by those who report to him, and it cannot be challenged. It can be rescinded, right? So if I, as the author of a memorandum, say, hey, I have second thoughts about this, I no longer want you to do it, I can rescind my memorandum, but Congress cannot challenge it, and it cannot be challenged by the courts. So why is it important to know the difference in an executive order and an executive memorandum? I'm taking the time to call out the difference in the 2 because many of the executive orders that we're going to review in just 1 minute have been challenged in the court. Okay? So many of the executive orders that we're going to review have been challenged by the courts. However, executive memorandums cannot be challenged. They can only be rescinded. And if they are not rescinded, that means the persons who have received the memorandum, which are typically by large persons who work for the executive branch, they still have to carry out the executive memorandum. And so with every executive order that we're going to review, there's an executive memorandum that gives the details on how to do that. So the executive memorandums and the task and the requirements attached to that memorandum are still being carried out, though the executive order is being challenged in the courts. Okay, so that's important for you to understand. So, what are the executive orders and what are the executive memorandums? To help me kind of just keep track of all the things, I've lumped them into three categories: funding, immigration, and DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's take a look at the executive orders and memorandums in their respective categories. The first one is going to be funding. The first executive order is called Expanding Educational Freedom and Opportunity for Families. Now, on the surface, this sounds wonderful. Why wouldn't we want to expand educational freedom and opportunities for families? This executive order directs the Department of Education to take money from public schools and to give it instead to private and parochial schools. So, what's the concern with that? Again, going back to what the Department of Education does, it makes sure that IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that it enforces that particular law. And that is the law that makes sure that students who have IEPs and 504s to specifically address their learning disabilities, mental health disorders, physical disabilities, so and so on and so forth, that is the law that they are protecting. And that is what the law does. Public schools educate a vast and overwhelming majority of students with IEPs. If you go to a private school or a parochial school, especially in elementary school and middle school, they're pretty clear that they do not have special educators, they don't have access to related service providers, they are not able to implement an IEP. Public schools, by and large, are the ones who implement implement IEPs and support students who have nuanced needs. So about 10 to 15% of students in any school district at any given time have an IEP. That's literally millions of students that this particular executive order is going to impact. So while it may sound good, the title sounds like, yeah, let's do it. What you're actually doing is taking away supports from students who need them. The other executive order under funding, and please forgive me for looking at my notes. I don't have all of these things memorized, so I'm gonna look down on occasion, and I hope that you'll forgive me for that. The other is not an executive order. I stand corrected. It's an executive memorandum. And it was called Temporary Pause of Agency Grant, Loan, and Other Financial Assistance Program. This memorandum literally stopped immediately federal spending. And it did it under the auspices of making sure that we were auditing our records and making sure that we were spending our money wisely. Again, no one can argue with making sure that you're auditing your records. I am a business owner. I audit my records regularly. I am a head of household. I audit my personal records, right? My personal bank account regularly to make sure that money is being spent responsibly. The concern with this, or why people had the reaction to it that they did, is because it required an immediate pause. So if I am a college student, right, 60% of college students receive funding from the Department of Education to go to school. So if I am a college student, we are halfway through the year, and I hear that effective immediately, I have no more access to my grants and loans. I'm panicked. How am I going to matriculate through my school year? How am I going to earn my degree without this particular assistance from the federal government. And I just want to be clear that you don't necessarily have to be impoverished to need loans and grants from the Department of Education to go to school. There are many colleges who are that are upwards of $70,000 a year. And there are many people who do not make that as an annual salary. That doesn't necessarily make you impoverished simply because you don't have an additional $70,000 to pay for your student or to pay for yourself to go through college. So again, the idea of doing an audit, we're here for that. The purpose is how it was done and how it was worded, okay? An immediate stop, an immediate pause, which left everyone who needed the federal resources, and many people need federal resources just to survive, not even thrive, just survive. So that was a concern with that particular memorandum. Again, it was called the Temporary Pause of Agency Grant Loan and Other Financial Assistance Programs. And the second memorandum is quite comparable to the executive order that I just talked about. Remember, I told you many of the memorandums and the executive orders go hand in hand. And while the executive orders are being challenged in the courts, the memorandums are still being carried out. So this is a memorandum that is being carried out, and it is called the Memorandum on School Choice and Educational Freedom. Again, it directs the Department of Education to take money from public schools and to give it to private and parochial schools. The second category we're going to discuss is immigration, and this is easy because it's only one executive order. This is the executive order called Protecting the American People Against Invasion. Again, the title of the executive order really is misleading because it makes you want to say, yes, I mean, of course, as an American, I want to be protected against invasion. Let's do it. The problem with this particular executive order is that this is the executive order that allow ICE involvement in schools. And I'm certain that you have heard by now that many students, many schools who have students with high numbers of immigration, they're reporting that their students just quite simply are not showing up to school due to fear and uncertainty. And I could certainly understand why. As an elementary school student, as a middle school student, even a high school student, going to school only to be approached by an ICE agent, that's very intimidating and scary. You don't know what's going to happen from that. You don't know if your safety is in jeopardy. You don't know if your freedom is in jeopardy. You do know that you're powerless in the situation. And I think that's very unfair to do to children. This very same executive order also cuts federal funding for sanctuary cities and non-governmental organizations that provide services to undocumented families. So if I am an immigrant and I have been going to a nonprofit organization and I am living in a city like DC or Baltimore, the services that I've been receiving are automatically cut off. That means that I do not have the resources, again, to meet my basic needs for my family. The third and final category is DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And by and large, these executive orders, two memorandums, they impact the LGBTQ community. What they do in sum total is they take away funding to schools that have sex education programs that talk about sexual identity, sexual expression, and things of that nature. There is an executive order and a memorandum that does that. There is also an executive order called the Executive Order on Gender Affirming Care. And what this particular executive order does is it directs federal regulators to cut insurance coverage from any gender affirming treatments for young people, and it restricts federal funding for medical professionals and institutions providing such care, right? So if you were receiving any type of gender affirming care, that has been immediately cut off. So there's really no way for us to know right now how that would impact a person, not only psychologically, but biologically, right? We would have to do the research on that to find out what the impact is on that. And then there's an executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism. Again, the name is very eye-catching. It'll really stop you in your tracks and say, hey, we do want to defend our women from extremism, gender ideology extremism. However, when you read the details of this particular executive order, what it does is it takes away the option to identify as anything other than male or female. The federal government does not recognize non-binary. The federal government does not recognize transgender. And there is an executive memorandum that reinforces that or tells the Department of Education what steps to take to make sure they are following what may or may not eventually become law by way of the executive order. So why are these executive orders? Why are these executive memorandums? Why are they dangerous? The executive orders and the memorandums ultimately perpetuate harmful narratives and undermine the well-being of students. They lead to an erosion of support systems for millions of students who need access to those supports and can only get them in public schools. They lead to discrimination. When you look at the different policies, it's very clear that the LGBTQ plus community has been targeted. It is very clear that immigrants have been targeted. It is very clear that those who are impoverished have been targeted, very discriminatory. And if that's not enough, they also perpetuate fear and uncertainty. So I am not here to argue against your beliefs. You may agree with every last one of the executive orders and the executive memorandums. You feel like these policies are good, they are helpful. You cannot identify because you aren't an immigrant. You've never been impoverished. You are not a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And so you feel like these policies are separate and apart from you. They don't impact you or your child at all. I understand that, and I am not trying to argue against your views or your beliefs. I do want to call out, however, that they do cause unnecessary human suffering. Okay, so I talked about Maslow a little bit earlier, and I'm going to circle back to Maslow. Y'all know I always talk about Maslow, and I'm going to work him into a conversation one way or the other. But we've already talked about the fact that many students no longer will have access to their basic needs, right? That's food, clothing, shelter. Right after food, clothing, shelter, the next basic need that Maslow calls out is safety. And people don't feel safe. They don't feel seen. They don't feel validated. They don't feel any of those things. The next level is belonging. Well, how do I feel like I belong when I can't even ask you to identify with me or have a conversation with me or see me the same way I see myself, right? So first is the physiological needs, it's the safety needs, it's the belonging needs, then the esteem needs, then self-actualization. So we can't even expect our students to learn when we are attacking or taking away their right that they had effective December 31st, 2024. We're taking them away immediately, suddenly, without any type of warning. So if you can connect with human suffering, if you understand that we are sending our children to school to learn, and they cannot do that or self-actualize according to Maslow until their basic needs are met, unless they feel safe, when they feel like they belong, when they feel good about themselves, then and only then can we ask them to self-actualize. And you understand that those 4 executive orders and those 4 memorandums completely take away the three bases to self-actualize, then you understand the conflict. If you don't even care about Maslow, then I'm hoping that you can connect with unnecessary human suffering. So what do you do? How do you make sure that your student is being supported, especially if your student has been directly impacted by any of these executive orders or executive memorandums? I hope that you've been paying attention to MsDrKenya on all of our socials because we've been very clear since about November on all of the different things that you can do to make sure that you are advocating at every level, right? So that's the first thing that you can do. Advocate at all levels, at the state level, the local level, the school level. What does this look like? This means making sure that you go to school board meetings, that you let your views and your opinions be heard. This means that you are joining your child's PTA, that you're going to those meetings and making sure that your voice is heard. It means that you are contacting your state representatives to advocate for policies that support equitable funding and mental health services. It means that you are staying informed. I will be the first one to admit things have been a little bit overwhelming. No, things have been a lot overwhelming since January 20th. There have been many executive orders and executive memorandums that have been signed. And staying on top of all of the things and how they impact you on a practical level can be overwhelming. I understand. However, we have to stay informed. You got to know what's going on around you, again, at every level, so that you can advocate. And then once you stay informed, make sure that you share the information that you've learned with other people in your community so that they too can understand what's going on and how it impacts them, so that if they have the need and the desire, they too can be active, that they can join in the advocacy. But addition to advocating at the state levels, the local levels, and at the school levels, in addition to staying informed, the most powerful thing you can do is to support your child directly. Talk to your kids about what's happening in their lives. Let them know that you see them, that you hear them, that their thoughts and opinions are valid to you. You can also teach them self-advocacy skills to help them to express their needs to their teachers and their school counselors. So as you are learning and you are becoming more involved and you are polishing your advocacy skills, share those skills and techniques and strategies with your student so that they can do the same when you're not with them. We've not left you unsupported. So Kaleidoscope Wellness and Education Group, we have 3 products that can help you with all of these things. The first thing we have is our free ebook titled Help is Here, Access to Student Support Services in Schools. I highly recommend, if you are concerned about your student and your student needs support and you don't know exactly how to go about accessing those supports, go ahead and download the ebook. It's a free ebook and it'll walk you through the steps, or at least give you some general guidance that'll walk you through the steps. If you want to take a deeper dive and learn further, then I highly recommend that you become a member of our Empowered Parent Academy. This is where we actually sit down week by week for 8 weeks, do live webinars and have discussions where I personally walk you through the information and all of the steps and help you to personalize it for your student, your jurisdiction. We go from the general to the specific and the Empowered Parent Academy. And then the last thing we have for you is access to our app, the Kscope, Kscope, Kscope Wellness and Education app. Again, the app is free. It is on both the App Store and Google Play, available in both English and Spanish. And it is a one-stop shop for all things mental health, right? We do talk about what mental health is, what it is not. We talk about some of the common disorders that children and youth deal with, to include trauma associated with being an other. We allow students to take screeners if they're not sure if they are actually dealing with signs and symptoms that may need clinical attention. And if they are, they can also schedule an appointment to meet with a mental health therapist. And it's all right there on the app for free. Ultimately, I hope that this information was helpful for you, that you understand or are aware of the executive orders that impact our students and the executive memorandums, that you understand that while the executive orders have been challenged, are being challenged in the courts, the executive memorandums still stand, right? There was one executive memorandum that was rescinded, and that was the memorandum that I was talking about that had an immediate halt on federal spending. That executive memorandum has been rescinded. Every other executive memorandum has not been rescinded and is being carried out. So I want you to understand that difference there. And finally, I certainly hope that you have a healthier respect, if not a healthy respect of the Department of Education and everything they do for our students. They are a very important organization and institution, and we need them for more reasons that I can count. Ultimately, I want to say thank you for joining me this month, and I look forward to seeing you in March. Bye.